All right, welcome everybody to the June 26th, 2017 meeting of Kubernetes SIG service catalog. I will put a link to the agenda in the chat. First up on the agenda today is that one of the things that we have been talking about for quite a while is that we are all interested in moving the service catalog repo to a beta level. And in order to focus on beta, I've discussed with Aaron, Doug, and Vile last week that we should be focusing exclusively on the Open Service Broker API integration with the service catalog. And so I sent an email about this to the mailing list earlier, but just to clarify things a little bit, I think that other integrations, like with other projects, or if someone's got another API they're interested in integrating, that we should discuss after we're at a beta level. And that my own personal subjective opinion for what I think beta level of Open Service Broker API integration is that we implement the use cases in the API correctly, with the exception of route services and volume services, which are really Cloud Foundry specific and not straightforward at all to implement in Kubernetes. And then in addition to that, we should implement the error checking semantics of the spec correctly. I've been talking with a lot of folks about the different errors to check and what the error handling should be. And as many of you are aware, there's this orphans part of the Open Service Broker API spec that deals with error handling, but it's not especially clear. And so as part of getting catalog to beta, I think that we need to get clarification on that part of the spec and then implement things correctly. So in addition to all that, like the catalog and controller need to be robust in the face of misbehaved brokers, and a busted broker should not bust the catalog, I guess would be how I would articulate that. And then there are some other odds and ends that I think that we'll uncover as we discuss this in GitHub. So what I propose is that anybody that is interested in working to establish what the beta criteria is should audit the list of issues that are currently in the 0.1.0 bucket. That's the milestone that we use to represent beta. And if you find that something is missing from that milestone, you should check the other issues in the repository to make sure that it hasn't been created yet. And if there's no issue for it open already, please feel free to open a new one and say that you believe that it should be considered for beta. If you find another issue that is open but not in that milestone yet, feel free to comment and say that you think that it's part of beta and we can discuss it. I will say in advance, because I've had a couple mismatches with people in the last week, is that after working on Kubernetes for 3 years, just about, GitHub notifications are basically meaningless for me personally, even with heavy filtering. So if there is a particular thing that you would like me to look at, please feel free to email me at the email address on my GitHub account, which is just pmori@redhat.com. And do not assume that I have seen your where you have tagged me into GitHub. So I think they're trying to jog my memory here and make sure that I've covered what I thought was the criteria to the best of my ability. I think one other thing is that it would be really great to have a set of use case documentation for what the catalog actually implements. We have some of this, but it's gotten a little bit stale. So if anybody is interested in attending that stuff, I'd love to have volunteers for that. Now I know that you were also interested in this topic, so I'll give you the floor for a second, and you can say if you think that I've represented accurately what you had in mind, or if you had something else, and then we'll open the floor for a little bit to see if anybody else has suggestions for beta.
Well, I think that everything you said is correct, and I just looked at some use case in some cases in the source code, and I just found some holes there that somewhere we just assume that there is no secret, for example, and just try to create, or like if it exists, we assume that it belongs to us and things like that. So we need to be more careful, I guess, not just with dealing with the responses from OSB, but also with our own stuff. So we need to not assume anything, I guess, and just try to like cover all the edges here. So yeah, but with the rest, I absolutely agree.
Okay, cool. So how about anybody else? Are there any immediate knee-jerk things that are major that folks would like to mention? Keeping in mind that we'll need to have everything represented in GitHub.
Yeah, Paul, the only thing I'd want to mention is that I really wish people would take the opportunity to go through and look at what we're doing from a usability perspective to make sure that the user interaction model that we're designing here makes sense in terms of it's usable, it's easy, and it covers a lot of the use cases that we don't necessarily talk about often. For example, multiple bindings to the same application. When you go to upgrade your application, what do you do from the Kubernetes side? How is that going to impact us from the service broker side? Is it going to force a new binding to be created when you didn't need one to be? Stuff like that. I want to work through those scenarios to make sure we cover those, because some of those may expose design flaws. And once we go to beta, it's going to be a lot harder to change those design flaws.
Okay, fair enough. If you have any of those things in mind already that we don't have GitHub issues for, I'd love to get them while they're in your head.
Yeah, I'll make sure they're there.
Okay, cool. All right. Anybody else before we move on?
Well, I had a question. I don't know if it's related to the current topic or not, but the email that Aaron sent out about only requiring 2 LGTMs for the next 4 weeks is an interesting choice because we presumably have a different policy normally because we care about quality and buy-in and everything else, and we're basically saying, hey, you know what, we can give on that just because relays on location or something. If 2 LGTM is good enough the next 4 weeks, why isn't it good enough ongoing? It's kind of my question.
So my immediate reaction to that is that I personally think 1 LGTM and an approval would be good enough, which is basically equivalent to 2 LGTMs, and it's what we do elsewhere. I do not personally see any utility from requiring 3, period, and that's my own subjective opinion.
Right, but I mean, this group had adopted a particular stance, and we either change it and say this is the new one, or I mean, doing a temporary, hey, for a while, you can slip things in with less oversight and more seems like a strange thing.
Martin,
I'm all for changing it. I'm just making a point that either change it or stick to it, but don't do this half-ass thing.
Right, Martin. My point of view is I think it's just a realization that given the different organizations that are allowed to LGTM right now, basically having one of them go on vacation for a month is a bit of an impact. And that's the reason behind it. Personally, I don't think, I agree with you in the general sense that if we set up a rule, we should stick to it. But then every now and then reality does have to stick up its ugly head and you have to adjust. Personally, I would rather, if we're going to look at adjusting the rules, I would rather adjust it so that we allow more than one person from a company to do the LGTM, but keep it at 3.
So I will point out that Kibbles is on the job, and Brendan is also back from his time off. So it's not like, Google has gone on vacation.
Understood.
So just bring it out there.
So I tell you what, I think these issues are generally ones that are strange attractors. I totally hear what you're saying, Martin, and I don't think that anybody intends to cut Google out in any way. So if people would like to review pull requests, I suggest that everybody try to review pull requests on a daily basis. That's what I try to do. Any objections to moving on? I know we have a fair amount of other stuff on the agenda for today. Okay, I think that yields Aaron. Aaron, you had an item on the agenda for talking about test refactorings.
Yeah, so as a follow-up to the first sub-bullet on focus for beta, which reads correctly implement the OSB spec. And the second is also important here, which as a reminder is covering non-success scenarios. I'm going to be focusing a lot on tests around those edge cases and tests around correctly implementing the OSB spec. That's something that, Paul, you've also focused on the last week or maybe a little bit more as well. So there are some GitHub issues. I will be submitting some more, and you'll also see some PRs around this work. The test refactoring work is intended to just shorten the existing tests we have. So refactor out some of the checks we have, some of the setup logic we have, and make it generic enough to use across the suite of tests or a sub-suite of tests at least. And then the second piece, of course, is to do things like Neil said, is to check to make sure that we can handle the case where the secret already exists or something similar. And those are what I have called edge case testing. So as I said, I'll create issues for as many things as I can think of right now. More issues to come, of course. And if someone is looking to jump into the code base, this is where I would like, this is where I will be focusing, as I said. This is where I would like a lot of the group's focus to be as well, so that we can push towards beta with as much quality and as quickly as we can, of course. So if you've got questions on, you want to jump in, where to start, ping me. I can talk to you about that. And then, of course, reviews. There will be pull requests coming in at a decent rate at least. Reviews are going to be more than welcome. And that goes for anybody. If you want to review pull requests, if you have time or bandwidth to do so, please do so from anybody. That is it for that point. So I'll cede back to you, Paul. Paul, you're muted.
So next up, Nal, there's an agenda item that you put on here about rebasing. I'm not clear on the wording of this regarding like to be released this or next week. Maybe you can say a few words about this while you talk about your item.
So about this week or next week, I'm just saying that the 1.7 will be released very soon. So we could line up with it and just like we have already a PR for it. It's not finished yet. Do we want to finish it? Like it's currently, I think it's based on master, but obviously it will be very similar to what we will have once we start rebasing it on 1.7. Yeah, and as you said, there are a bunch of breaking changes, which we probably need to discuss and decide whether it's fine for us. And I think in general, we probably should do it more often to make it less painful.
Yeah, I think that we should do it more often. And I actually went to SIG API Machinery last week to request that the folks there in that SIG that are working on the machinery begin trying to move in the direction of publishing basically release notes for the API machinery, because right now, my own prior experience in this area has been that when you start a rebase onto a new version of the machinery, it's basically like, you're like, all right, well, I have one candle and I've got a cave that I'm going to go into and I hope my candle doesn't go out. Oops, my candle went out in the first foot and then I'm just jumping hurdles in the dark. So in order to make it possible to release on or rebase on a regular basis, we probably need to work with the API machinery group to help them move in that direction. I don't know that we can wait for that to exist before we move on to the machinery, so I think it would be a good idea, probably once 1.7 is released, to finish the existing pull that rebases onto what I'd prefer to be like onto the final version of the API machinery that's in 1.7.0, just from a general standpoint of that's probably going to make it easier to assess what the differences are when we next pull the machinery in. But I'm totally in agreement that we should be doing it regularly. It has been very challenging, as I think that the Atlassian folks are probably aware of now, to actually perform that rebase. But I'm all about doing it more frequently, and I'm happy that we now have a larger pool of people with some experience doing that. Does anybody disagree that probably after, well, let me phrase it this way. I propose that we do the next rebase after 1.7 goes out, and we use the 1.7.0 machinery. I think the current pull requests can stay open. There probably won't be a lot of rebasing the rebase that has to be done to get that pull request in. And once that happens, and we have a working pull, I'm happy to merge it. Does anybody disagree with that?
No disagreement.
Okay. So one thing that I think probably the biggest thing that will change things about the walkthrough is that the insecure option is dropped in that version of the machinery. I think that may change the walkthrough a little bit. It will definitely change the chart slightly, but I think that's okay as long as we just coordinate and ensure that there isn't something left in the walkthrough that you can't do after the rebase. That's probably the biggest thing. Now, can you think of anything else that is big like that?
No, I think insecure server is the only blocker here.
So actually, there is a fairly big other thing, but I don't think it affects us, which is that since the 1.7 machinery uses protobuf serialization and etcd by default, that you cannot express a difference in protobuf between an empty array type, or a field that's an array that's empty, and a field that's an array that's not set. I think there were a couple places where this had meaning in the core API. I think pod security policy was one of those. I don't think it has any effect on our API, but it's something that is worth considering. I think the only array type that we actually have in the API is the conditions array, and I don't think that an empty array versus nil has any meaning on those fields because they're derived from what is present in that array. So nil versus empty, not a big distinction. Can anybody else think of anything?
I think that's a no.
Yeah, I'm hearing a no. So I tell you what, that's good to have that put to bed. I think we have an issue that is open for determining the cadence that we do it on. I guess we didn't really talk about that. So to me, ideally, we would probably want to pick up every point release of Kubernetes API machinery, so that we're picking up, like, say that we're in 1.8 development cycle, we would want to pick up 1.7.0, obviously, that's what we already discussed, and pick up 1.7.1 if there are substantial, or if there are changes, 1.7.2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That should be more manageable than sipping from master. And it might be a little difficult if we're depending on API machinery changes to go in. But at this point, I don't think that we are in that position. So hypothetically, if there are easy enough to consume release notes and we find that it can be an exercise that doesn't take a tremendous amount of time, I'd be totally fine with doing it on every point release. What does everybody else think about that?
I think point releases is probably the most sane thing. I don't see us tracking master ever, really.
Yeah, me neither. And Doug, I do agree that that there is a need for awareness that the API machinery needs to be stable. I think that if we rebase on point releases, that we would naturally get that, because I would not see large changes going into a point release because they had to be picked. I think that might still leave some. It doesn't guard against when you go from 1.7x to 1.8.0, but it might protect us on kind of like the normal, what I would think would be the normal rebase situation. And when I say normal, I mean that if we were to rebase on point releases, that we would normally mostly be doing those rebases, and that hypothetically speaking, you would expect them to not be tremendously different from the last point release, like bug fixes only.
Yeah, no, and I don't necessarily disagree with what you guys are saying in terms of tracking master being a pain in the butt. But at the same time, if someone does have the spare cycles or spare machinery to do a nightly build with master, is that we were notified immediately when they break something, and we can notify them immediately that, you know, to make sure it was an intentional breakage, that could only be goodness.
Yeah, one other thing worth mentioning is that as far as the API machinery group is concerned, aggregator is going beta in 1.7. So the expected, we expect to start guaranteeing backward compatibility for the aggregator code once 1.7 releases.
Cool.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I do think that, so I want to say, like, for folks that may not have a lot of background on the context for this discussion, or that might be watching on the internet, just so that I'm fully representing how I feel about this subject. Like, I do want to say, I think API Machinery Group has had a pretty tremendous challenge that they've been working towards, of moving these components out of the main code base, and that I also want folks to understand that API Machinery is kind of in an unfortunate position in the sense that there are things that don't strictly fall under API Machinery that the API Machinery SIG tracks, and they tend to be in the middle of things that kind of blow up on the internet. So I think that we should approach the situation with empathy for that, and knowledge that API Machinery has a lot of their own challenges, and that we should be prepared to work with them to make the changes that we want to see. So I actually, this reminds me of something that I was thinking about over the weekend, which is that I think it would be really productive if we could have folks that are contributors to this repository, the incubator repository for catalog. If we could have a couple folks that that regularly attend the API machinery SIG and the auth SIG as examples, I think that those are two SIGs that we have a fairly large subject matter overlap with for one reason or another. I think the API machinery one is obvious. The auth one is that the future of Kubernetes secrets is being decided by the auth SIG, and that since we have use cases that touch it, like secret parameters and things going into secrets, it would be great if we had some folks that would be willing to regularly attend those meetings and keep track of what is going on in those SIGs, and maybe report back periodically when there's something important. So I'm going to make an attempt to be at both of those whenever they happen, but I'm just one person, and I am very far from perfect. So no need to raise your hand now, but if someone is interested in doing that, I would love it if you'd send a message to the SIG service catalog mailing list, and we'll try to work that into future meeting agendas, because there are way too many things going on in Kubernetes for people to possibly follow them all. I think it would be great if you say you're interested in going to SIG auth, then probably it's not going to be feasible to do that for API machinery too, unless you have a significant amount of time to devote to doing those things.
So my understanding was SIG PM is one of the avenues that exists for kind of what you've suggested, Paul. To be more specific, it's an avenue for us to learn about the intentions of these groups that we care about, and also for us to provide feedback back to them related to our use cases. So am I correct there or not?
I don't think SIG PM is really the right level, or is the right place to have that level of discussion, because they stay pretty high level. It's more like, okay, in general, what features are you doing at a SIG level? If you want to have deeper conversations, like I think what we're talking about here in terms of syncing up, I think it's better to talk directly to the other group.
Right. But it would be helpful for us, I think, not necessarily, like you said, Doug, to talk about technical details, but us to raise the issue through that venue that, for example, hey, we care about secrets, and we want to give a brain dump on what our issues with secrets and how the changes will affect us, and then using that to be the avenue. And that would be instead of having someone designated to just go to every meeting. So essentially push instead of pull.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I still don't think PM is the right group for that, because the number of people that are there each week varies, and I really don't think they're going to get into that level of discussion. I think the best place for what you're talking about is actually the SIG architecture group, which is in the process of being stood up. I think that might be a better place for it. But in the meantime, I would still talk directly to the group.
Yeah, I think that as an example, so I'll pick one that we haven't already been over. For example, there was a thread recently about not adding new uses of secrets that non-core infrastructure was going to use that didn't target pods. I don't think this is something that anybody in SIG PM would ever know about. I would love to be wrong, but that is just my read of that SIG, is that those kinds of like development guidance, I wouldn't necessarily expect to flow through that channel. I think we can totally do that. I don't see there being a reason not to, but at this point I expect that it will be most effective if we have folks that are actually attending those meetings. And I also know in the case of API machinery, let me put it this way. I think that it's difficult to get the right degree of communication on the right channels correct. I know that at least it's my perception that there might be some frustration within the API machinery group about certain things vis-a-vis how frequently and in what channels things were communicated. And I don't think there's a perfect solution to that problem. Like I said, I think that this is perhaps one of those areas where, as a community, we don't know the best way to message about those things yet. So probably whatever we try to do, we'll have to pay attention and say, is what we chose to do effective? Is there another way or another mode of communication that we can use that might be more effective? And maybe something will come out of that.
Yeah, and I mean, to sort of add to Paul's earlier point, from the SIG API machinery perspective, one of the things we feel like is going on is everyone feels like they need to communicate and communicate better. And so everyone wants to communicate more. And it seems like a lot of messages are being drowned out. And so the idea of having people where we need strong communication channels, like I'm from the API machinery SIG, and I'm here to try and help with that communication. Hopefully that'll help. If anyone needs or has questions about API machinery, please reach out to me. But if you think you need to talk with API machinery or auth, and you've got strong overlap, I think at some level that's going to work better than SIG architecture where everyone wants to be heard.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Would you state for the record your name and Slack handle so that folks could get in touch with you?
Sure. So my name is Walter Fender. I'm one of the engineers from Google on API machinery. And on Slack, I'm Chef Taco, CHEFTAKO. And yeah, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about API machinery, want to know what's going on, why something isn't being done, or suggestions for things we can do to help you make your lives easier.
So Walter, would you be willing to take some time to do a preliminary review of the rebase pull request?
Absolutely. And in fact, most of my last month has been spent trying to make the aggregation system cleaner and easier to use, work out of the box, that sort of thing. So yeah, I would be happy to do that.
Awesome. I tell you what, I think that since it is your stated part of your day job to do that, that I will look to you for future API machinery updates. So I'll give you a heads up if we're gonna put something on the agenda where I'll ask you, or feel free to just edit the agenda. If you're part of the Google group for SIG Service Catalog, you should have edit rights to just put something on the agenda when there's anything that you'd like to communicate.
Sounds good. Will do.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Walter. Okay, so Aaron, I think you had something next, which I just read in the agenda, but my mosquito brain is not held on to. But anyway, you have the floor.
Sure. So we have talked a little bit about the 1.7 the upcoming release and then refactor as well. So my proposal would be that we, from a UX perspective, for a new user coming into Service Catalog, we keep 2 walkthrough documents, one for 1.6 and prior, and then one for 1.7 and onward. And I am suggesting this because there are, I believe, enough changes to the user experience, not necessarily technically, but enough changes to the user experience after 1.7 that the documents should be different enough and should be separated for a new user to come in. So I have a few examples, but before I talk about those, I would like to hear some preliminary reactions.
So the gist of what you're suggesting is that we have a separate 1.6 and 1.7 walkthrough?
That's correct.
I think that makes sense, since we expect 1.6 to be fairly different than the ultimate experience on 1.7.
I think it's not just the 1.6 or 1.7 release of API machinery. It's also tied to our own release. So it could be just 1 point, whatever is the latest release of service catalog. I mean, can we actually have like separate two walkthroughs keeping updated to against? Is it about Kubernetes release or is it about API machinery release, Aaron?
In this case, it's about the Kubernetes release, because the aggregator story, as an example, varies pretty considerably between 1.6 and 1.7.
Okay. You mean API aggregation?
So what Paul said, plus for the near future, possibly this could change after beta, but for the near future, our releases should work on both 1.6 Kubernetes releases and 1.7.
Okay, makes sense. I mean that like after rebasing on 1.7, we still have to update the 1.6 walkthrough if it makes sense, right?
Yes, if we have changes that will require the user to do something different when they are running a Kubernetes 1.6 cluster, we should and must make changes to the 1.6 walkthrough. But I would like to expand on that for a second. If we do make such changes, we should also have that discussion in one of these meetings as well.
Okay.
So, aside from API, aside from API aggregation, can you list off some of the differences that you're aware of?
So insecure is another difference. And I cannot think of any off the top of my head right now. I have a list somewhere that I can try and share.
Yeah, but insecure is part of API machinery, which means that both 1.6 and 1.7 will have to deal with secure only, I guess, if we don't want to support like two branches of service catalog at the same time.
So there are likely to be so I can point to one thing that is between 1.7 and 1.8 is that clustered garbage collection does not work for aggregated APIs in 1.7. We expect it to in 1.8, but that's an example of probably a significant difference across major release boundaries that might affect the catalog. So I think it does make sense to me potentially to have different versions of the walkthrough for different major versions of Kube. But as part of that, I think that we should discuss how long we're going to maintain those things, since I would like to not be maintaining a 1.6 walkthrough in a year.
Yeah, and that's fine. We can make that more generic decision later. But even for insecure, we'll take that as an example. Even down to the commands, the kubectl commands that someone must use, those will be different across 1.6 and 1.7. And as it stands, the walkthrough for 1.6 that we have in the repo now is pretty long. I'd rather not include even more that a user has to parse in a walkthrough, that they need to decide this command for 1.6, this command for 1.7, and so on and so forth. So Paul, that also goes to your what should we support long-term question. But for now, I would say we need to support at least 1.6 and 1.7, and we need to have two documents for those two cluster versions.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Just out of curiosity, Aaron, if there are some cases like the insecure thing, is it not possible to run 1.6 with security turned on? Then you can't get the same UX for 1.7.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Maybe I didn't understand. When you say insecure, is it because insecure is turned off in 1.7?
Well, right now, insecure is turned on by default per the instructions in the walkthrough. What Neil said is there will be no way to turn on insecure, or otherwise said, to turn off secure serving. So the setup instructions for 1.6 will be different than they are right now after we upgrade our dependency on API machinery. But additionally, when using service catalog against a 1.7 cluster, so there's a Kubernetes cluster version is 1.7, the setup instructions will be different there as well, because we'll be able to talk through the aggregator.
Right. No, I understand. I don't interpret this as pushing back on having two if we need to. I'm all for that, because I agree with you. Having conceptual if statements in there for documentation for a walkthrough would just ruin the user experience. I agree with that. But I was just wondering whether it would make sense in this particular case, whether it would make sense to turn on security for 1.6. That way you can't have the same user experience.
Well, I think we'll have to, but the user experience will still be different, right? Because talking to the aggregator, it at least doesn't require a user to set up a context, but also, Neil and Paul, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't believe you'll have to think about about cert management between kubectl and the API, the service catalog API server. Instead, you'll have to deal with concerns cert management between the aggregator and API server. And those setup instructions, from what I've read so far, are pretty different.
Okay, fair enough.
So Paul, Neil, anybody else, Morgan, anybody else, do you guys agree?
Yeah, I think that we need to differentiate 1.7 versus 1.6. I think that we should not differentiate at any finer grained level than major release to major release, though, because if you add another dimension to this, you wind up with at least 3 walkthroughs. And at that point, I would expect it would be impossible to keep them in sync.
Well, so Doug, did I answer your question? I'm not sure I did.
I think you did, but to be honest, a little bit of the security terminology went a little bit over my head, so I'm assuming you're right.
Okay.
And that's fine, because I agree with you in general. If we have to do it, we have to do it.
Okay. Maybe we can talk offline, because I'd like to make sure I get your question correct before I move on with this task as well.
Okay, that's fine.
Cool. I'll ping you right after this.
Okay.
Okay, so we have 15 minutes left. I wonder if there are any things that folks wanted to bring up. Otherwise, we can get that 15 minutes of time back. All right, I'm hearing a no. Thanks for coming, everybody. Aaron, I'll be very interested to know how you like that crazy fan that I just noticed in the background. And that is about the ability that I had to filter things between my brain and my mouth. All right. See you all next week or sooner. Bye.